Greetings, friends. Wantingruska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of January 1st through January 11th of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give you the thumbs up. I hope you guys are having an awesome day because this is our first update for 2026. I was gonna say that when we first started this year, it's Christmas time for the Orthodox people, which is it's also so I hope you guys had a wonderful Christmas and a wonderful New Year, and if you are Orthodox for the Christmas part. And this week we have a lot of updates. Not actually a lot. We actually originally was kind of slow rolling. I thought this week would be kind of like a very slow update. I was gonna call it like General Winter freezes the front line, but we actually start getting a lot of interesting updates that are interesting to talk about for this first week or so of January. Now, the first place we're going to start off is in Kupyansk because there's a lot of things happening. Now, the Kupyansk area is something where the Ukrainians had a lot of success towards the end of last year. At first, everyone thought Kupyansk was fully captured by the Russians, but then we showed that was all a banana show. Now, that being said, I was under the impression that by the end of last year, that Russia was going to lose Kupyansk, at least the western part. And the thing is, it looks like the Russians are now starting to try to stabilize the situation, but it is still a bit precarious. But it is not a complete rout as it was originally I thought. Well, not at least it's not going to turn into a major rout. It was still a big banana, but it was not that much of a big rout because the Russians are still holding on in western Kupyansk, mostly in this this northern area. Most sources are saying that the southern part of western Kupyansk has been fully retaken by the Ukrainians, and most of the western northern part. Now, this area in like the very center, like right here, is mostly under full Russian control, and then this area to the north around the hospital and around these high-rise buildings right here. So like the northeastern part of Kupyansk is more of a gray zone. We had actually positions of the Russians being bombed here. So, the Ukrainians have captured much of western Kupyansk, but it was due to infiltration networks. So it's hard to try to dislodge the Russians from every single point. And the Russians still have their positions in the eastern part of Kupyansk to put troops over. So the Russians are still holding up a very spirited defense. It's very interesting. They're still holding on. It could still be the case the Ukrainians managed to fully kick them out finally, but as for almost the middle of January, they're still holding on, and the Russians are now doing counterattacks. So it seems like the Russians there is a chance of them holding on to western Kupyansk and then having to restart their operation to clear once they actually secure better positions and make their supply lines better. But I thought they would be fully kicked out, but it seems like they're still holding on. So that is what's happening now. The Ukrainians have cleared out most of the southwestern part of Kupyansk, so that's good for them. But they were actually trying to do counterattacks to kick the Russians out of this northern part here by taking the main fortified area, the bakery in this area. But the Russians were able to recapture it. So it seems like the Russian positions in this northwestern part is still in a solid position. So seems like the Ukrainian counteroffensive here did a lot of damage, but it is being slowed down. Another thing that's interesting is in this northern part. I thought this northern part would be completely cleared, but it seems we got geolocation of the Russians doing a big attack and landing troops in this eastern part of the village of Tishishnika here. And then we had another geolocation of the Ukrainians attacking and gaining positions in the southern part of Dnipropetrovsk. And I think in the opposite, we had a position of the Ukrainians being in the southern part of Kharkov, and then like a day or two later, we had the Russians being in this eastern part here. So it does show that there's actually very fluid. Again, the thing about front lines here is that there's no longer a solid front line. It's very much a big fluid mixing of fluids, and so you have positions where the Ukrainians are in Kharkov, but you have Russians in Tishishnovka. So it's a very big big gray zone. It's very hard to determine when you're analyzing about how solid are these positions, how much consolidation is there, because you have you could have one or two troops infiltrate, but that doesn't mean you actually control it. Now that actually brings us to the other part of which actually had a lot of interesting things. So during this past week or so in January, we actually had Russian troops being shelled in this western part of Krylovka and in the northern part here as well, showing that so we had two instances of the Russians being in Krylovka, and we had another position in the most eastern part of Polody, this village right here, of the Russians raising their flags here. Now, when I say this kind of pins up to what we were talking about before, is because you could again, this flying is very fluid. You couldn't send 2, 3 troops, maybe even 1 troop, and they could probably go by undetected, and then raise the flags there. So we had just because we had geolocation of the Russians, and the thing is, I do not trust for a lick of second the Russian command here. I am absolutely certain that this is something the Russian command in. Again, I said this before, that there's something in the Oskol River that makes the Russian commanders and in this like direction just retarded, the most retarded people on the planet. So there's a lot of banana, as we saw with the very banana handling of Kupyansk, but. So I have no doubt that maybe they're like, hey, we claim that we take Korolyevka and Polodovia because the Russian Ministry of Defense have claimed that they have captured Petropavlovka, Kucherivka, Poloda, Korolyevka. So according to the Russians, they control this entire area right here. But that is not the case, and maybe they do it because they send 1 or 2 guys there, and then suddenly they claim the whole position. But it's probably a lot more fluid. Now that being said, that means that it goes both directions. It might be fluid for the Russians where they don't actually have they're not actually fully solidly in control of Polodia and Korolyevka. Maybe they're able, because they're able to enter it. It's obviously not pure Ukrainian control too. I'm betting that the Ukrainians are able to everything beyond the Oskol River is such a bitch to supply that probably the main they have their main supply dumps that are being put in Kupyansk, Vusoloya. So it's right on the river. It's a pretty big area, so they're able to accumulate here. But then anything beyond that, like in these fields here, there's just this giant gray zone. There's not Ukrainians defending Pashana, for example, like what this map shows. But that being said, there's probably no Russians there either. So what the Russians are hoping to do is that they could clear out this how do you say it? This eastern part of Kupyansk, they could then have a solid position in the northern part to accumulate troops and then actually hold positions at Petropavlovka. Because right now these villages, right to the east of Kupyansk, are just a big gray zone. So it's very hard to map exactly who controls what's the gray zone. I mean, there could be intermixing of positions. Same thing is happening in Kupyansk too. So very big gray zone. But one thing about now this was the biggest banana part for the Russians in all of for the end of 2025. So the fact that now they're restarting operations, looks like they're trying to reassert initiative in this area, shows that yes, the Russians were set back, but it seems like they're halting any more damage being done at the very least. So we shall see how that develops. And yeah, so yeah, we'll see how that develops for the Russians. So yeah, the back and forth of Kupyansk is still ongoing. For the rest of Kharkov, nothing much has happened. It seizure after the seizure of Volchansk, there's been a bit of a slowdown in operations. The main changes is that between the villages of Propylik and Lyman, it seems like this kind of area is being cleared by the Russians. I do think the Russians will move towards Kharovskia and Semyonivka just to maybe have a bit more of a southern expansion here a little bit. But besides that, I don't see any more advances. The only other advance we got is that the Russians also are now battling for the center of Volchansky Kuturoya. So there's like some warehouses in the center, so some areas they can accumulate, but it just seems like they're just trying to link up with their kind of this western edge position near Tika, which protected their flank here from Ukrainian attacks as they advanced towards Volchansk. So it seems like they're just advancing to this village just to maybe they make their front line more slighted, so more flattened. So the battle for Volchansky Kuturoya is in full swing, but besides that, nothing much has changed in the rest of the Kharkov region. Alright, now we're going to go to the other place where there's been a lot of back and forth, and this time mostly... Oh, actually, before we start that, also in this area, I'll just talk this part of Kharkov. Most mappers have shown that the towns of Bukoslavka and Novoplanonovka are still under Ukrainian control, so the Russian push to try to create the northern bridgehead for their offensive towards Borova is still ongoing. Again, banana in this direction, the Russians claimed they cleared this, but again, it was just maybe they had 1 or 2 troops able to enter these villages, but they weren't able to consolidate. So again, it seems like the Russian command in the Kupyansk sector is very much like, once we had troops there, we'll just claim that we captured it. It's very banana. Anyway, yeah, so this salient to the north of Belorov is still being fought over. However, Bashorvka, Andriivka, and the kind of the areas around it have mostly been secured by the Russians, so at least they have that. Anyway, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction, and this is where the Russians are actually having a lot of interesting big updates this last week. A lot of something's very much going wrong for the Ukrainians in this northern Lyman direction because there's been a lot of breakthroughs here. The first, I think we talked about this at the last week of 2025. But we talked about how we had a position of the Russians in the train station village of Sontsova being attacked by the Ukrainians. This week we had another update of the Russians being on the eastern part of the town of Svetohersk here. Being, I think, around, moving along the river in this most eastern part, and most mappers, even Ukrainians are claiming that the western part of Yurova is also under Russian control. Now, I think we had geolocation of the Russians being attacked here last a week or two ago, but pro-Russian sources are saying that the entire town of Yarova has been completely captured, which can make sense. And so we're still trying to get a better idea of what's happening here, but it does seem like this kind of northern defense, because we had another update of the Russians being in the eastern houses of Alexandrivka here. So maybe that was DRG, we don't know. But again, because and not only that, we had some troops or some Ukrainian sources are saying the Russians are able to infiltrate all the way up to Lazova here. So it seems like this northern defense node is cracking. It seems like maybe the Ukrainians have been sending all their reinforcements to defend Lyman itself. They're just trying to send them through these areas and try to defend Lyman, but maybe in the process they've been, not thinning out, but just not reinforcing as much as northern defense, and because of that, the Russians are making a lot more progress here. If Yurova falls, then that cuts off the entire northern defense for Lyman. Yes, and then the only way to supply them will be through the river here in the Seversky Donets. So. Very bad news for this northern defense. So we still don't know the exact position. A lot of this, again, front ends are very fluid. But are the Russians still consolidating in Sontsivka, or were they able to take all of Yurova and consolidate here? Are they how deep is the infiltration in Svetohersk and Alexandrivka? We don't know. So very much a lot of interesting questions going on here, especially in the northern part of North. We actually had a geolocation that came out yesterday of the Russians actually being in full control of Rekadup. There was a back and forth going on for this town, like towards in the summer of 2025, and then it ended. The Ukrainians kicked the Russians out once they fully captured it, and then not fully out, and then we never heard of Rekadup again for a couple months. And then suddenly we got an update showing the Russians have fully recaptured Rekadup. And I probably would venture to say that this eastern part of Kharkovka on the other side of this river here is also probably under Russian control. So, this area right here. So, as we can see, this northern part of the defense of Lyman is actually kind of crumbling. And maybe because the Ukrainians have put all the reinforcements in Lyman, because that's the big city battle, they kind of forgot that they also should support the northern flank here. Because again, Lyman is it's very important to take Lyman, but again, the main point of the Russians here is to take everything to the other side of the Oska River. And so this kind of expansion in the northern part of the Lyman direction is very bad news for the Ukrainians and good news for the Russians. A bit more to where the south is, where there's been not that much changes, probably because this is where the Ukrainians have been trying to reinforce in the Lyman direction. The battles for Dubrova and Orozhina are still ongoing. The Russians claim they have completely captured Dubrova. I think we had geolocation of the Russians being bombed in the northern part of Dubrova here. But again, maybe this is very fluid. Maybe they're not able to consolidate here, but maybe there's no Ukrainians. The Russians haven't even claimed they've taken Orozhina, so maybe that hasn't been taken yet. So yeah, the battle for these two villages and these forests in the southern part of Lyman is where some of the most fiercest clashes are taking place. Along with this, the DRGs in Lyman itself have been mostly kicked out, but again, we had another. This map shows that the Russians have infiltrated in the northern part of Lyman, have been taking these little warehouses to the north of Lyman. I don't know about that. But so the Ukrainians are holding on to Lyman as much as they can. That's probably where they're trying to accumulate all forces, and the squeeze around Lyman is just getting worse and worse. But so I'm just wondering when they're going to do a direct assault into Lyman and try to consolidate some areas here. So, but I do think Lyman will probably be one of the first big kind of battles that will end in Russian favor in 2026, just because the Russians did a lot of the heavy lifting in their 2025 offensive. But yeah, that's the Lyman direction. No update on Dobropillya. I'm pretty certain that's something the Russians will have to take, but it seems like they're not able to take it just yet, maybe because the Ukrainians are also reinforcing that a lot. But in any case, the northern part very banana for the Ukrainians, but the Lyman is still holding on. But every week passes, it gets worse and worse for the Ukrainians here. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk directions. this area right here. This is where the Russians made a lot of big progress in 2025, and I would venture to say in 2026, this is actually where they will be doing a lot of their big changes, a lot of big gains this week, or this year, and this first week is no exception. They're making a lot of progress. A lot of progress mostly on what we would traditionally call the Zaporizhia direction, this area right here. And the biggest changes, we talked about it at the end of the year, the Russians secured Stephanhersk and, secured some of the fields around it. So now the Russians are now expanding their offensive and made a lot of rapid progress. The biggest change, according to most mappers, is that the Russians have basically completely captured the town of Primorska, which reaches up to the Konkonka River right here. And so they have not claimed it just yet, probably because it also extends all the way up to here to these dachas towards the town of Richny and all that. So maybe it's a lot more of a gray zone, but we had most mappers, even some Ukrainian ones, are saying that this northern part where the Ukrainians were held up or have been infiltrated and taken by the Russians. So this long village has been taken by the Russians. And so that's a very big gain for the Russians. I always said that they would probably reach the Konoka River and pause. One thing to keep in mind here is that, again, I use Syriac maps just because I think it's the best way to illustrate the war. But one thing about it is that, it doesn't show like the actual current update. For example, a lot of people are saying that this Konoka River, because of the because the Novokakhovka Dam was blown up like 2-3 years ago, is like no longer being like supplied by water. It got like all filtered away. So like, there's like a big dry bend here, so the Russians can actually cross here if they want to. So this map is a bit illusionary about the defense here. So again, I'm only basing it off the map I see. So obviously I'm like, well, the Russians will stop at the Konovka River. Maybe they don't. Maybe this is like the Konovka River doesn't exist anymore. It's like a stream, like a little puddle, and they're able to enter Mala Katerinivka here. Who knows? We shall see. But anyway, the main and also we had some Russian movements to the northeast here. We talked about how the Russians claim they take how do you say this? Leukemia here, and some Russian sources are saying that there's now DRG activity towards Nova Kalovka here. This is actually the high ground position in this entire kind of western Zaporizhia direction here. But a lot of major progress has been happening. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but a lot of these fields to the north of Stepova have been taken, and a lot of sources are saying that these fields here have been taken as well. And so, as we can see, the main Russian push here is towards the Konovka River to the north, and trying to take these set of villages here which is on the more high ground. And then once they're here, the main push will be towards the town of Yurivka. Because once they reach here, then they'll be able to then start cutting off majorly the highway that connects Zaporizhia city with Kharkov, which is in tandem with where the operation this group of forces east here, the eastern group of forces from Dobropillya, which right now they're battling for the Gancha River defense line, which is the last major Zaporizhia defense line for the Ukrainians. And there's basically and so once they break through here, then they're going to break through towards this highway, the Amulet Highway. So as you can see, the Russians from here are going to try to cut this highway. The Russians from here are going to try to cut this highway. And so again, the main purpose here is to encircle Kharkov here. So that's kind of the main focus of these offensive here. So we can see that they're after the fall of Stephanhersk, they're expanding and blooming out here, and we shall see how that develops there. Along with this, in the more same place around Kharkov, the Russians have completely captured the town of Bilahora. We had a geolocation of not the Russians raising their flags, but the Russians being at least in this area. So Bilahora is probably just something they wanted to take to secure their northern flank a little bit. But I'm pretty certain that this village has been bombed to pieces and just kind of taken in name only. But again, a little small gain for the Russians here. It probably does support with positions about the Russians being in Mala-Takhmachka. So there's been no update here, but a lot of mappers have been adjusting it based on their sources. But we haven't had any geolocations per se. But most mappers are saying that the most eastern part of Mala-Takhmachka, especially and most importantly, this prison colony is under Russian control, but the western part of Mala-Takhmachka is under Ukrainian control. The Russians claim they have completely captured Mala-Takhmachka, but that is not the case. But I was wondering, so most mappers are saying that's kind of split in half. So if the Russians are in charge of the prison here, then they have a solid foothold in Mala-Takhmachka. It's a big stronghold to have forces in. So, it's very good for the Russians to hold on to Mala-Takhmachka here. So, a little bit interesting. So, I thought the Russians were kicked out of Mala-Takhmachka, but we shall see how that. But it seems like they're still in control at least half of it. So, looks like this kind of area near Kharkov is a bit more solidified. Now, where everyone's always interested, our very favorite group, the Group of Forces Vostok Eastern Group, this area right here, where they made a lot of progress last year, and they're making pretty decent progress this year as well. A bit of a slowdown after they captured Glyapolya, but there's now stopping. The main thing here is that the Russians are completely captured the town of Zelenia to the north of Glyapolya. And not only that, according to that, they've been pushing northwards and have captured this small little, I think this is a special education center. I don't know why there's a giant special disabled area right in the middle of nowhere. But it seems actually kind of tranquil. It looks like where Hogwarts would take place. Anyway, but in any case, the Russians have captured Zelenia to the north of Glyapolya and are now pushing westwards across that. And some sources are saying they're now clearing the town of Dnipropetrovsk here. And so forth. So lots of big gains in this area right here. Along with this, the Russians are now pushing away from Glyapolya. Have captured captured these warehouses here, captured some of these tree lines out to the western part, and it seems like they're probably the Ukrainians have a strong defense around Zaporizhia. Again, there's a bunch of trenches to the north of it to defend from a direct attack. But if the Russians could attack it from like maybe this area or from this area, it might make the defense not as defendable as you would assume. So it seems like maybe they're preparing. Maybe the Russians are going to push through here, move into Svatopetrivka, Staro, Ukraina, Krichishnova, reach this rail line right here, and then cut off Zaporizhia from the north, and then maybe do a direct attack. But I think they're probably just accumulating forces in Glyapolya to do a direct attack towards Zaporizhia. So the Russians are just proving their positions around Glyapolya. Along with this, the Russians are in the north, are expanding the bridge here. The biggest news is that they completely captured the town of Borastovka here. This town right here, as you can see, a very decent-sized town for them to take. This also was in accumulation with when they took Andriivka about 2 weeks ago, so it seems like they're just improving their northern flank a lot. So again, it's not just these towns that are important. It's that there's a huge amount of defense networks along this river. Like for example, we had the Ukrainians attacking Russian positions in Perelutovka. Now in Perelutovka, it's just a one-way street village. There's not very much here, but there's a bunch of concrete bunkers and trenches and fortifications here that the Russians are holding on. So the Ukrainians are doing a counterattack, trying to dislodge Russians from their positions around this area in Perelutovka. And maybe, I don't know, I think in that thing they took a stronghold, but anyway, and it does show that the Russians have this bridgehead on the northern part in the southern part of Ternavata, but maybe it's just DRG, so maybe it's not consolidated, we don't know. But in any case, this bridgehead on the other side of the Gansha River is, putting more and more strain on the main Russian objective, which is Ternavata here, so lots of big gains there. And yeah, so that's kind of the biggest things in this direction, and not really that much else. But again, this is the last line of defense. The Ukrainians have been sending reinforcements here, but I have no doubts that probably within a month or so, the Russians will take Ternavata and Zaporizhia and finally break the Ukrainian defenses here. And then probably by March or so, maybe April, if they're going to reach this line to the north of Kharkov. That is my prediction. But yeah, that's what's happening in the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk directions. Now we're going to go to the Dobropillya direction, this area in the former Pokrovsk area. This is where, where most of the big president of the fall of Pokrovsk and Leningrad happened. And after that happened, there's been a huge slowdown in operations. There's not been that much changes in this direction. There's been some small ones, though. The biggest thing is that... let's see, where do we start? Well, the thing is that the battle for Rodinsky is still ongoing. The battle for this town will go on forever because it's such very strategically important. The Ukrainians do not want the Russians to hold on to this town because this is a very big stepping off point towards Belitsky, and they'll continue counterattacking because they really don't want the Russians to hold on to Rodinsky here. So the battle for Rodinsky is just going to be going back and forth until the Russians do a major offensive that puts the Ukrainians back on their feet and makes them hold up here and makes the Russians be able to hold on to Rodinsky. But the battle for Rodinsky is still ongoing. The main big thing for the Russians is that the Russians are just continuously improving their positions into this northern part here. The Russians have recaptured these small dachas and this area around these kind of blue rivers right here. So this area right here. This map is finally updated showing that Novoshakhova and Ivanovka are under full Russian control, but they probably have been blown up to smithereens by this point. The Russian Ministry of Defense says they've also controlled Vilna, which makes sense, but I think this is a village that only exists in name only. Okay, it actually has some buildings, but I feel like these buildings have been blown up to smithereens. A lot of these small villages that are like contested, like don't stand a chance. They've been completely destroyed. So maybe there's just like ruins. But in any case, they are making progress, though. They are improving to the north of Shakova, taking more and more of these fields to the north there. So just improving their northern positions a lot better. Along with this, it seems like, according to this mapper, they're now entering Toretska here, which makes sense. I do think that this should have been happening when they were in Kucherov Yar, but maybe they're trying to take Toretska just to maybe as a prelude to going back to Kucherov Yar. We shall see. But in any case, the Russians are making are now into the southern part of Toretska, according to this map. But we shall see how that battle develops. So lots of good progress for the Russians in this northern, like, Dobropillya area where their salient was, but kind of in, like, near Pokrovsk and Leningrad itself, it's been a rapid slowdown, and there's been no real big changes. The biggest, as we're in this direction, kind of the more interesting areas is kind of happening here in Novopavlovka. Most sources are saying that these fields that used to house a lot of Ukrainian troops have been cleared by the Russians. We also had more and more confirmation that this like bridgehead on the other side of the Volchka River here between Ivanovka and Novopavlovka is still under Russian control. This probably goes in line with like what we've seen in Ivanovka, where we had Russians in Ivanovka. So I do think that if the Russians are still in full control of Ivanovka, this allows them to support a contingent in these fields between Novopavlovka and Ivanovka. So the Ukrainians were doing massive attacks to try to dislodge the Russians from Ivanovka, but it seems like they're still there. And along with this, most sources are saying that that the Russians are slowly but surely clearing the southern part of the Novopavlovka area, but this battle for Novopavlovka has been going forever. But it seems like the Russians are finally breaking the back of the Ukrainians on the other side of the river and forcing them to the other side of the river. So the Ukrainians can probably hold on to northern Novopavlovka, but it seems like the Russians are slowly but surely squeezing the Ukrainians out of the southern part, and they're about to take it. So we shall see how that develops. But yeah, the battle for Novopavlovka is still ongoing, but tilting towards Russian favor. Along with this, a lot of changes have been going on in these fields to the west of Pokrovsk. The biggest thing is that the Russians are in full control of the Pokrovsk mine. We got that 100% confirmed. But it seems like there's a lot of like back and forth. The Ukrainians are attacking around these fields, and the Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians out of there. So it seems like the main battles are now trying to take these fields and maybe there might be a big Russian push towards the town of Sigirievka. We shall see. Along this, the Russians are continuously pushing in Novopillya here, but we only had one geolocation like 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Russians being in this eastern part, and that some Russian sources are saying they have controlled the western part. I mean the central part, and only the western part remains. The Ukrainian sources are saying this is just a big gray zone. So we shall see. Maybe Novopillya will fall to the Russians, which will make taking Sigirievka a little bit easier, but that is also a battle that's still going. So not a lot of changes in the Dobropillya direction, but it is probably the calm, and the Russians will restart operations soon. Now, where the Russians are making a lot of actually very interesting progress, it seems like maybe this is where they're going to make a lot of their more biggest focus, is in the Kostiantynivka direction, and this is where most of the a lot of interesting changes have happened here, and it seems like the slowdown operations have not affected Kostiantynivka that much, because there's been a lot of rapid progress there. The biggest change is in the southern sector. As we can see, the Russians are making a lot of progress, capturing a ton of these fields to the west of Plichivka. Along with this, we had geolocation of the Russians being in these trenches. Here, we also had some Russian DRGs actively operating inside the town of Ilinovka right here. And I think in Berostok too. So these are two southern villages that control the southern approaches to Konstantinovka. And it seems like, along with this, most sources saying the Russians have captured this strong defense, which is on the high ground here of this roundabout. They call this the traffic roundabout. As you can see, even on on Google Maps, you can see that it's completely, has a lot of trenches and everything like that. So the conquest of this fortified area on a high ground is very bad news for the Ukrainians by the Russians. And also, we have the Russians advancing in these areas right here. So it seems like that this entire northern sector of the Klubin-Balka reservoir has been taken by the Russians here, and it seems like they're about to do a huge assault on Berezovsk anytime soon here, just to have a position. The thing is that the between Konstantinivka and like the main Russian positions in like Toretsk and all that it's just a bunch of open fields, and all these villages have been blown to hell, and so. If the Russians want to approach there, it's huge. There's a huge drone kill area that's very hard to how do you say it to infiltrate. So it's very hard to actually enter Konstantinivka, and so there's no you have to just kind of go through these open fields before entering here. So it's very hard to actually infiltrate Konstantinivka, especially in the wintertime when all the trees are dead. So that being said, the Russians are still doing more. So it's very actually hard for the Russians to attack Konstantinivka with supplies. But that being said, there's still a lot of interesting things going on. There's something very interesting of the Russians being able to break through here and maybe continue their offensive here. So I do think that the Russians will take Berezovsk. Maybe they'll do an offensive on Stepanovka very soon. And then from there, maybe they'll start moving to Tovobalka, Ilinovka, and in the meantime, the Russians are also pushing in their traditional area in the southeastern part of Konstantinivka. The biggest change is that the Russians have captured what they call the Konstantinivka railway station, this area right here. We actually had geolocation of the Russians being here. So this area right here has been captured by the Russians. And most of us are saying that everything to the south of this like kind of highway has also been captured by the Russians. So the Russians do have positions in the southeastern part of Konstantinivka. They have a presence in the city, so they're in the city, they're battling for it. But again, to reinforce Russian positions here, it's just very hard to go from, the main Russian supply hub in Toretsk all the way to Konstantinivka. So it's, it's hard to do that. Anyway, we shall see how that develops, though. And yeah, the lots of changes happening in Konstantinivka specifically. So I do think this is another area. Lyman probably is going to be first to fall, but Konstantinivka is a very close second. Might be the first, in terms of what will fall. One of the big Russian, because again, the Russians did a lot of maneuvering in 2025 to take it, but I do think that within the first half of 2026, Konstantinivka and Lyman will fall to the Russians. But right now the Russians are making a lot of progress here, and especially in the north too. There's been a lot more changes here than usually we don't see. The biggest thing is that the Russians we had geolocation confirming that Novomarkova is under full Russian control. We had I think we had geolocation of the Russians being in the southern part of Markova here in these fields here, and according to pro-Russian sources, that the town of Markova has also been completely captured by the Russians. So another big gain for the Russians. Along with this, a lot of sources are saying that Russians have completely captured the town of Verolubovka here. Now, we don't have like geolocation of the Russians like raising their flags here or like being there, as we have in like say Markova where we had them there, or Novomarkova. They weren't raising their flags, but they were raising bombs, so it does show that they were in these two villages. But most mappers are saying that Verolubovka has been taken by the Russians, so we shall see how that develops. And now the forces that hold the Konstantinivka to the Severus is called the Group of Forces South, and they're also banana. They're almost as bad as the forces in Kupyansk, except they're very much over exaggerating who they take. Like for example, they claim they took like Kelinovo and Bisamivka, these two villages right here, but it's again they're maybe that's just because they had DRG activity there and then they claim that, but so yeah, that's what's happening there. And then this time we how do you say it? But yeah, there is some movement in the northern part of Konstantinivka for sure. There is like movement in this, capturing more and more of this northern part. And I do think that eventually the Russians will reach this rail line here and have all this captured. And then from here, they'll be able to then envelop Konstantinivka from the north, just like they're doing from the south. So lots of dangerous things happening in Konstantinivka, and yeah, we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go in the Slavyansk direction, in the former Seversk area. There's been some small changes here as well in the Slavyansk direction. The biggest changes actually are coming in the southern part here. The biggest thing is that we had confirmation of the Russians entering the town of Manivka here. These like kind of three villages, Prilivka, Golubovka, Manivka, have been like the center of Ukrainian resistance here, because it was right on the front line since the fall of Bakhmut all those years ago. So right now the Russians have entered Manivka and are battling for the village. So very bad news for the Ukrainians here. Along with this, we had sources showing that the Russians have completely captured the town of Bendornovka here. So this town from so this kind of area right here has been captured, and it seems like a lot of sources are saying they're going to be like moving towards Perlivka here, because if the Russians could break through this like kind of these dense this dense fortified area, these villages, they'll be able to take a bunch of areas along the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and then just like push the front line, just kind of keep moving up along the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and can move towards the southern part of Ray Alexandrivka, which is kind of the goal for the Russians here, because this is the next major town that's it's on the high ground, and it gives them over. And once they capture it and they reach the canal, they're able to then start droning Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and all that. So, moving toward in the southern direction definitely helps put the squeeze on it as well. Along with this, in the Slavyansk direction, the Russians that are now battling for the town of Rizhnivka are now pushing more and more along these ravines to the north here that I've and such. We have more geolocations of the Russians being in these areas. So before it was just unconfirmed map rumors, but we had geolocations showing the Russians are here. They're also still in Zakhitnya, but it seems like the Ukrainians are putting a lot of fortified, a lot of troops here to prevent a Russian breakthrough in Zakhitnya, because if they take Zakhitnya, the Ukrainians defending Orzhyn and Dobrova are going to be a lot more trouble. So maybe they're trying to put more forces here than before. So we shall see. But yeah, but slowly but surely moving that way. Yeah, so just the Russians making more and more progress here every week, and we shall see how that develops in the Slavyansk direction. And then lastly, but not leastly, we actually have, we're going to go to the Sumy direction, and we actually have some changes happening in the Sumy direction, believe it or not. The biggest thing is that the Russians have restarted their offensive around this area. Maybe it's a small localized one just to retake what the Ukrainians took. So far they did part one of it. They have recaptured the town of Andriivka and have captured the fields to the south of Alexivka. So they took this back. I think the next thing they're probably going to try to take back Kondratovka here. But so that's part two, because once they take back Kondratovka, they would have reversed all the gains the Ukrainians made in their Sumy offensive here. But yeah, and Andriivka and Alexivka have been retaken. Along with this, most sources are saying that the Russian offensive in the south here has been kind of they've secured themselves around Graborovsky here and Vasovka here and taken moved along the rail lines. But besides that, they have not been able to take Razny, and that would have been a very good gain for the Russians. But it seems like this was just a very localized counterattack, and there's been no other. They were just here to hold down Ukrainian positions. But yeah, it seems like the Russians are now activating in Sumy just to put another pressure point on the Ukrainians. And also along this, there's been a massive missile attack that's basically made Kiev without heating or electricity, along with a lot of other stuff. And also the Russians used Oreshnik again in Lvov. And the campaign to knock the electricity out is still in full force. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian update. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these updates. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. Comment your thoughts, like this video, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.